Welcome to Between Shelves.
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and meta-modernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
To learn,
listen,
and become.
All right. Welcome to the final dialogue for season 1.
Yeah.
I know, right? It has come to that time. We need a breaking point, time to reflect.
Correct. No, I think you're right. I think it's a time to pause a bit to look at what we've been talking about in what it'll be like 12, 13 episodes.
13.
13, right? And just take a little break to recap and see where we'll go next. But it's been a great ride so far.
Yeah. Humbling.
Yes. We've had some phenomenal guests that we've had the honor to speak with.
Oh, yeah.
Brian Dempsey, Jermaine Marvel, Philip Butler, Tracy West, and Catherine Keller. All just wonderful guests that we've had the honor of speaking with.
Definitely.
And have dialogue on the different aspects. Actually, they've been initial attempts with meta-modernism and defining it there.
Definitely.
And how it kind of coincides with their work. And so I would say that's groundbreaking in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very exciting. That's very
Definitely.
exciting. And maybe just for this debrief, it'll be good to kind of go over what we've been talking about all this time. And it's really been this question of what the heck is meta-modernism?
Yes.
That's really what it's been about. If you were to think about that for a second, how would you define what meta-modernism is?
It's interesting because in the beginning, we thought that meta-modernism was this like only philosophical thing, But over the last 13 episodes, we can't honestly say that we believe that's that. Like metamodernism has become more of something we don't really fully understand, but we're trying to learn more about. It seems like it has potential to have boundless abundance, but that also brings about chaos. And so we've learned also like there needs to be some sort of balance. And we learned that this is a multi-dimensional balancing. Like we're trying to balance many things at once. It's not as binary as we maybe thought it was. It's not just for the intellectuals. That's a big stigma that has been kind of fading as we were going through these episodes. This is more for everybody. But how do we explain it like that? How do we invite people to say, hey, that feeling you're having, it's important. And maybe you should take action on it. Like that kind of approach, instead of just saying, hey, I got this,
I agree that there is multiple layers to metamodernism. And what we're seeing with, at least from our earlier conversations, like particularly Brian Dempsey and Jermaine Marvel, great. If you have, for the audience, if you haven't heard those two podcasts, take a moment and listen to them. You know, looking at meta-modernism as something that is happening within our culture as we speak, and we're really trying to figure out what it is. And so it's great that we have this early definition. Is, you know, meta-modernity is sort of a reconciling of two different cultural frameworks that were witnessed historically, probably within the last 50, 60, 70 years, right? And we're just talking about the shifting from one era to this other one, and the two groups that was there. So modernity and meta-modernity. I mean, modernity and post-modernity. And to say that right now, what we're seeing is, in one way, is that is a good way to frame it. I don't think it's the only way we can frame today's culture. I want to bring back something that Jermaine Marvel made note of, which is, you know, we might be in a hypermodernity, we might be in something else altogether. And he kind of holds on to what he calls a black metamodernism, which is grounded in a framework of thinking. But let me continue on. So metamodernity is, hey, it's not modernity, it's not post-modernity. It's not looking for these, you know, we were seeing in modernity before that there's these universal values, that there's these ultimates. And I think the world wars kind of shifted that framework of thinking because there were no powers that were perfect, right? United States was not was a superpower, but it wasn't the de facto superpower that everyone followed, right? You started to see kinks in the armor, and it led to sort of like this post-modern framework that was growing up in Europe, and then was taken on by multiple spaces in the United States, Latin America, and even a bit within Black cultural studies. And that postmodernism, that postmodernity was at least a space to explore identity and culture that wasn't grounded in universal values. Now you got tons of values, but you know, then we get into that problem is if we have tons of values, we have no values. I don't think so, but anyway, it's not relative. But as Catherine Keller says, it's resolute. We resolve ourselves to share the values and grow from them, even though they may be different, right? That's not relative. So if we're seeing this generation that says, hey, we don't want to have this super individuality that we see in postmodernism. We want some values that we can hold on together, like in modernity, but we just don't want what comes out of modernity. That's where metamodernism we see being born. And that's where oscillation, right? They start using this word oscillation. They may use the word paradox or ambiguous as ways of describing what they're trying to see what happens when they join together, right? What is that thing that they join together? It's fuzzy, it's blurred, it's ambiguous. You don't know what it is and what it isn't, right? It's paradox because it's showing one thing, but it's another, right? It is a quantum wave. The quantum wave that if you, at one moment you see it's hitting a specific spot, but when you do the two slits, and I think, I forgot, it's shown differently. It's when you're seeing it and when you're not seeing it. When you're not seeing it, we see a wave of it hitting in multiple locations. And when you see it, we always know that it's only hitting one location because when we engage, we develop a relationship, and that relationship creates a paradox. That relationship creates a paradox and a difference. And I think I'm using some process language and maybe some language that comes out of quantum physics to kind of explain what metamodernism is trying to explain from an aesthetic or cultural standpoint. That when we start honestly engaging multiple frameworks, multiple ways of thinking, things become very complex, things become very difficult. And so things are ambiguous because you want to have a strong value, but it's ambiguous what that value is because it's going to change. It changes when we start getting into relationship with others and seeing values and importance. And I think in one of the episodes, we were talking about the need for then a matrix right? Which is not one value, but a matrix of values that are both and at the same time. And Jermaine Marvel talks about that. I think he talks about a yes and or both and in his writing and his work, that from his Black meta-modern perspective is so important. So yeah, I mean, meta-modernity, at least in those initial parts, is that it's it's an identity that wants a solid formation and to have these distinct values, yet understanding at the same time that when it engages in another, it's going to change and shift. I'm no longer who I am. And I think that's why Catherine Keller, when we brought her in, spoke of her. I think she's speaking the same language. It's like it would be impossible for us to say that I was the same person as I was yesterday. My identity changes because I've learned something new. I'm engaged in something new. And the same thing applies in science. The same thing applies in everywhere. There's a shift. There's a time difference. Everything is different because of all of those components that are there. You don't, using the Heraclitean model, you never step in the river twice or the same river twice. It's different. So I'll pause. Get back to you. What do you think?
Oh yeah, you're spot on, spot on. These were all great things that we took away as well from 13 episodes. It's crazy. It was almost a year, right?
Been talking for
But
some
yeah, and I must say, like, we are not the same person, that we were when we started this podcast, or started episode one. We've learned so much and we've shed things and changed, with every dialogue. It was just like, wow, for me personally, speaking with, Brendan Dempsey, and he's been at this thing for years now, and so much information he brought about metamodernism and its open possibilities, we love that. And then the next transition was Jermaine Marvel putting us this new perspective of Black metamodernism, for me, it was just so brand new. And so that was
I
just
think just
really life changing. Please.
no, I want to ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
I think even in your own writing, your own work, you really were highlighting on this notion of race and the problem that we see. And when you were introduced to metamodernism as a framework for thinking, you were saying, well, how does it also speak to race? How does it understand race?
Right.
And so, I was wondering if you have a moment to think a bit about from these conversations, what happens to this question of race in metamodernism?
That's interesting.
Yes, it is.
In the 13 episodes, it wasn't until we started talking about feminism, gender, and transhumanism that we started to see race is like right in it. And that it's not that people are unaware, people just don't want to include that into something of priority, and this goes back to our deep yet surface level dialogue on womanism, feminism, and this idea that the oppression against the feminine and how it's been an issue for so long and nobody in power or in authority wants to solve it because they benefit off of it. You know, um, Race has become something of a dimension of thinking. Like years ago, we thought race is based on culture and skin complexion and rituals. But now we're starting to see race is real, but not real. That paradoxal space. So in metamodernism, it seems race is a phenomenon. Like we're still trying to comprehend how do we understand race and races if we're going to continue this language. And we've even seen online and, even probably in person amongst community, people disagree. There's still disagreement. You know, there's people that are avoiding it. A lot of people will say things, like, we don't see color. But in a meta-modern space, we have to see color. The space is a spectrum of color. To say I don't see color, you don't see nothing. So it's like, it shouldn't be like the thing that we hyper focus on, but it should be a layer in which we can engage through context and understand complicated things. You reminded me a few years ago, like, it matters. It comes with perspective. And you can't just wash that off. You can't just erase that. And I've never stopped thinking about that. And I was just like, you're right. I was so naive. I didn't understand, and you brought this wisdom that you've learned and you can't get rid of it. And this was before Meta-Modernism. So stepping into Meta-Modernism was like, yeah, you can't get rid of anything. Right.
The same way this is out of left field, but it's something I remember. You can't get rid of garbage. Garbage is there. There's no escaping it. And I had done a paper on the viviality of garbage and looking at the event that happened in Spanish Harlem. I think it was like 1950s, 60s during that time. I could be wrong on time. I'd have to look back at it. But the event was in Manhattan. There was a garbage problem, and the garbage they would someone get me dates. They would actually just throw it into the water. And when they were no longer able to do that, they had to find spaces to get rid of it. And so they started actually all the garbage that was in like the 60s to 100, because on 96th Street is where in Manhattan is where Spanish Harlem began. So everything under before that, from 60s to 96, they would take the garbage and dump it in Spanish Harlem to give it our problem, and they didn't have to worry about it. That, in essence, is sort of this portrayal of, hey, I don't have to deal with it. Someone else can. Or it's invisible. This is a good place. And what the residents of Spanish Harlem started doing was they started returning the garbage back so that in the next morning, they would see their garbage and engrossed, right, and enlarged in specific areas. And part of that resolve was saying, hey, don't throw your garbage on us. And it was a realization that, crap, we have to deal with it. We have to deal with the fact that we create garbage, that we create something, and that it may have a use. There's a consequence to it as well. And that consequence we have to work with, we have to deal with. So we either continue refining our process so we get rid of, so that consequence is no longer there, or we'll keep repeating the same process and we'll have an enlarged problem like we have now. Like, we don't even know where to put garbage. We have boats in the ocean on planet Earth that are just kind of revolving. They're all around. They're just like, hey, I'm going to go over here and see this coast, and then I'm going to go somewhere else because we have no place to put it. And that's just a stark reminder that it matters. Garbage matters. So I'm not trying to do a one-to-one on garbage and race, so please don't think that. But the thing that we don't want to deal with, we have to deal. That's what I want to say. And the thing we don't want to deal with is the most important thing we need to deal with. It's that. It's that, because that is a mirror of who we are.
You're speaking that shadow work, Carl Jung, you know?
Maybe I've been, influenced by my partner and your talk, which is all in that sense.
No, it's a great analogy. Garbage. It's the shadow. No one wants to deal with it.
And garbage has a life. Garbage is alive.
It's valid. There's things in it we need.
And that is the truth.
Yeah.
We don't want to deal with it. So yeah, I mean, I also want to highlight one more thing there. I'm appreciative that meta modernity wants to include it as a process of thinking. And yet I'm concerned because of the reality that modernity, in essence, kind of causes it, right? We think of slavery, when we think of, enlightenment, growth of technology or the industrial period, and this framework of thinking, of progress, in reality creates the issue of race or racism. And so then to say that we need to reconcile postmodernity with modernity is problematic and would need or require us to once again say, well, then we have to reckon with our history. And our history is the industrialization, right? The industrial revolution. The history is our Civil War era, the civil rights. This notion and this framework of thinking of progress and what that entails. The notion that there is a hierarchy, the notion of patriarchy. We have to reckon with that. You cannot not think about those components of modernity and then say we can work it together and we can create universal values. Because to have a universal value, guess what? That means all the other values are not valid. So how do we reconcile that? Postmodernity goes another route, right? It says, no, all value, all has value, which is why I like how Catherine Keller engages postmodernity and post-structuralism. She comes out with this notion of the resoluteness, right, which is how our perspective should be. It's not saying that it's relative. Roland Farber talks about this too, but it's resolute. We resolve ourselves to engage in the process of the relationship, to go back and forth, to allow novelty to happen, to allow this emergence to happen as an answer, not the answer, an answer that further engages the notion and the question. And that means we're always in a process of questioning because we have not gotten there. And I'm left struggling with that. I don't know if we can reconcile or just take the good parts of modernity and the good parts of postmodernity and say, hey, let's go with that. I don't think that works. I don't think that works out. I think, and I'll say this, and that's because of some issues I have with this, with the Hegelian dialectic, which is what I'm seeing there. Hegel would say, hey, here's a thesis, here's an antithesis, and we come up with this synthesis, right? But no one really understands that sometimes the way that works is the thesis is always first. The thesis is always correct. The antithesis may have something that's of value to the thesis. And here's my Google talking to me, so I apologize. But and let me stop it. I'm sorry. But I think the thing with that is the first is the thesis. It's right. That means the antithesis would be synthesized or put into the thesis to make it a better. I think that creates the same problem with the garbage analogy. We want to knock out the stuff we don't want. And I think you have to take that. I think you have to accept that. I think, and what I mean by that is I have to take it all in. All of it is important. All of it is important. It forces me to come to reckon with my own framework of thinking, what I've understood as history, what I've understood as the frame of thought. And now I have to join that together. That's why meta-modernism and its project is much more complex than what we think. And why these other forms, which are maybe a bit more skeptical or pessimistic, are continuing because of the complexity of it. Can it do it? I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. You made me think of how when we got introduced to Black metamodernism, it opened up this idea in my mind about metamodernism in general, and how metamodernism is all about not knowing. That's ultimately where you find yourself, I feel. You find yourself just not knowing and figuring out how to accept most things and accept that you don't accept everything. So it's kind of like this Buddhist essence as well, right? In the background of metamodernism. And then postmodernism is interesting because it seemed more linear. Like it was more of an investigative approach We found what's the problem. That's the problem. We know the problem. And then when you say, okay, now we know the problem, how do we rebuild? That's where it seems a little fuzzy, like it hasn't been pushed through a process further. And I find that very interesting because then that would become sort of a place where post colonial meta-modernism starts to emerge, right? Because it was interesting that you brought up modernism and postmodernism, but then these are things still built upon colonial imagination. So, how do we go back before that to try to figure out what true options or potential do we have outside of the colonial imagination? And that colonial imagination includes the Hegel model, this whole idea of thesis is everything. That's a man trying to just suppose their position, and prove to people that this is true, this is right, but interesting enough, meta-modernism is not about proving. Like, we go back to what happens when I have a perspective, others have a perspective, but I need to try to understand that we're all equal. Even though I don't fully understand their perspective, and I may naturally think that my perspective is true and right, it's like metamodernism pushes the consciousness, the process of thinking to say, hey, wait, all perspectives are valid. There is no one right. So now you have to kind of change how you go about thinking about what's healthy, what's for the best, especially when we're thinking like collectively, like in a community, right? How do we prevent dictatorship from emerging versus some, you know, uh, de-centered communitarian kind of, you know, offspring, something that we can continue to imagine, but we clearly haven't fully seen it on this plane of existence yet, you know? And that is the play on to how can we imagine outside the colonial imagination? And it's hard because the colonial imagination is valid too. That's what's messed up about it.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that, because that was my question to you. You know, you're espousing that this thing is better. I'm gonna. I think that's the difficult part. I think we struggle with that, because when we see out of our context, we start realizing you can see why someone may feel this is better. Like I was teaching a class on Christianity, religious course on Christianity, and I had this wonderful reading piece looking at certain kings of the time period of Christianity. And when you start reading why they did what they did, I said these people had daddy issues. But you begin to understand why they did why they had done what they've done. Like one killed his brother, one killed this to make sure that he was, but it was all because of a father issue, a daddy issue, to make sure that they assert their power and they can be or live up to their father's dream. You can understand why that happens and why that becomes an option. Is it a fair option? Is it an option that benefits many? The answer to that would be no. And yet we still hold on to a majority of that because in reality it does in some way benefit many. I think the hopefulness of certain frameworks of thinking that you were talking about is that it fits the best for all, right? So the idea is the hope of a democracy and maybe a more socialist framework in which you have a number of persons that are contributing to the leadership of a nation is a better option than a king. because there's going to be no overthrowing. There's going to be no, none of this empire rule. Because we believe that's the best for society, but it's not the best for everyone. I feel like I don't need any of this. I can do this all by myself, and I can. So it's not the best for everyone, but it's the best for majority. And I think that's how we hopefully think our frameworks of thinking should be. But then a lot of people think differently on what the best frameworks for many should be. That's the difficult part. I recognize that. I think out of my upbringing and my practice, in philosophy and theology, I do think there are certain ways we should think about it. That would be in great conversation, and I want that to be in conversation with others that may think a little bit differently, so that there's growth. But there's something I remember my professor saying, Roland Farber. He said, "We will always have to do a little bit of violence," and what he meant by that was there is something you're going to have to say no to. That's it. And that no is, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to allow that. I'm not going to allow kingly rule to happen again because of what we see it producing, of how there's a disrespect for law, of which we find value in law. So there's always going to be the little violence of no. This can't be a part of it. The vision cannot include that. And he goes, that's just a necessity, because if not, that's the difference between resolute and relativity. Resolute says, okay, this is, here's my yeses and nos. You have your yeses and nos. Can some of those nos change? Can some of those yeses change? Because of the relationship built in that engagement. How much do I grow? How much do I, do I continue to, push the needle forward and go along in those respects? Because I think the resolute is that there's got to be questioning Buddhism and what they would consider evil, because they do say, yeah, desire is not good. It's not good. It's what's causing suffering. It causes suffering. Suffering is not good. I'll pause there. I mean, that's just me thinking about it. But I think you brought up a good point about the desire of what metamodernism is, the desire of it. Now, if the conversations have led to that, I'm not sure yet, but I think that's what conversations are meant for, and writing is meant for, to have those conversations.
In this season finale episode of Between Shelves, we reflect on metamodernism and prepare for the 12-month-long sabbatical ahead. Join us for a reflective dialogue with Raphael and Aaron. Together, we navigate the interplay between uncertainty and possibility, examining how metamodernism reframes our perspectives on meaning, ethics, race, identity, and coexistence in a complex world. Whether you're a seeker, a scholar, or just curious about the evolution of identity in our ever-changing world, this dialogue has something for you. Catch the latest dialogue Between Shelves, streaming now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Let's explore the in-between together. And now, let's return to our dialogue with Aaron and Raphael as we continue reflecting on metamodernism and how it reshapes our understanding of knowing and the ever-evolving journey of becoming in the 21st century.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You made me think of how over these 13 episodes, these experiences, these dialogues, we've come to a different place in thinking. We used to think that we had a good understanding of what we were desiring or looking for. But now we're realizing the things we thought were evil or bad are misunderstood. And so it becomes so complicated, because the things you need are also dirty, in the garbage. And to reiterate, it's so hard on a large scale. Humans haven't figured out how to make use of garbage. And on a meta-spiritual front, I feel like this represents humanity's lack of deeper shadow work on a collective front. Humans got a lot of shit, and we just haven't collectively dealt with it. And then we break up into our groups on our continents and we have even more shit, and it keeps going. But it's interesting because if we can't get rid of it and we got to make sense of it, I had to ask myself, what are you looking for? What are you looking for to confront? Like you said, we need some violence. Totally agree. Because, we can't. Little violence, yes. But the bigger point is some capacity of violence is necessary. It's not a good and bad thing. It's about what do we need to get to where we want to go. And I'm not saying that everyone should revolt, but revolution is necessary for a reason. Just like in a garden, you know, dealing with different soils, different contexts. Some soil you got to burn the crops, some soil you don't, to fertilize it or make it better. So on a meta spiritual front, that violence, we used to question that a lot, especially when we were in the MDiv. We were reading about Gandhi and the nonviolence, how it inspired MLK. And it's like, how does this nonviolence thing work in a context of hyperviolence? And they were right and wrong same time, right? And it's just interesting to me because, again, what are we looking for? And for me, I'm looking for hit points of control. How are we managing control here? That's my pushback. And I'm willing to apply that necessary violence in order to hold ground to say, yo, this is unacceptable. We can do better. You know, fear. What are we doing with fear? Are we using it to control the people? Are we helping people resolve or heal their fear? Come to terms with their fear, turning fear into inspiration. What are we doing with fear? Responsibility. That's a big one. People can sound good, look good, but are you responsible? Are you using your power in a responsible manner? And so these things just led me to appreciate more process and theopoetics. What were your thoughts?
You know, you gotta laugh. I was to reckon with something, to deal with it, is to acknowledge its existence. And I'm always remembering this. Whitehead talks about this, and Deleuze. Whitehead was saying that at every moment we are experiencing something. We experience the universe. Actually, that's what he says. And there's certain parts that we take in everything, but the reality is we can't process everything. So we take in the universe, and then at the moment it's just lost because we just can't process it all. But there are certain parts, he goes, that we will sort of anesthetize ourselves. And that anesthetization, which is to become numb to it, to make it not there. He goes, that's a choice we make. That's something we do. But then the question is, and we experience that. He does say we experience that. But is that experience helpful in progress or moving forward or in processing? That means we haven't processed it. We just decided a no. So we experience the no. And we continue to ignore it unless we do it. And for Whitehead, the better thing to do is to acknowledge it, to affirm it, so that we can reckon with it, so that we can deal with it. Deleuze says the same thing. His philosophy of difference is we affirm everything. Because when we affirm everything, then we can do something about it. And that brought me to think about how two things, how from an ecological standpoint or organismic standpoint, everything that's been made is has this ability to regenerate itself or recycle itself. For instance, in our organismic way, when I transition and I go into the ground, the earth has a good job of breaking me down and fertilizing the earth and I can become of something of different values. And I think when that transition happens, it is a reckoning. We deal with it in many ways: remembrance, memories, events, and all those type of things. In one aspect, I guess, in that more higher level intelligence, how do we keep it going so it informs others and it becomes part of the ethos and intellectual pursuit of everything else? Has that pan psychic mind. And then the earth does its job with the organism parts of it. And we see that when we talk about recycling, right? We have a compost, and the compost takes all of the vegetables and all of these things, and guess what? Turns it into dirt, fertilized dirt that we can use. Beautiful. And then the next thing I thought was, there's this young guy, he's a scientist, and he's been able to take plastic and convert it to fuel. And for me, I said, he's reckoning with that reality that we have this type of garbage and we need to do something about it. And his life's work has been turning it back into something useful. That work is hard work. That work is definitely not easy. It's fruitful. It's worth it. It's not easy, and not many people will believe you. Not many people believe him. I'm optimistic about it. But it led me to think what you were saying about that to deal with it. We have a lot of crap. We have to deal with it. But the way the earth does it, the way this young man has been doing it, is an example that good can come out of it. Something of worth, something of value comes when we do that work. And so I guess with meta-modernity, I know what it's trying to do. I know what it's trying to do. I'll continue to journey with it and see where it goes. But I'm left with those questions that I want to explore a bit more. How will it deal with? So, like, let's say meta-modernity and feminism, that we have a wonderful conversation. Feminism is growing by leaps and bounds, and I'm so excited for it. That it's growth from the suffrage movement to feminism to second wave, third wave, fourth wave, and fifth right now. Womanist theology, mujerista theology, and it grows. But all of those are outcomes of patriarchy, which comes out of modernity. And if we're to move away from that, then can we hold on to modernism, or should we just move on from it and think something different? Go for it. I'll pause there.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole stepping out of colonial thinking is interesting to me.
It's hard.
It,
I don't. Well, I go back into it because I'm going back into categories. It's just because those categories are still there. I mean, metamodernism still deals with categories. So Aaron, I'm maybe I want to ask you: is your understanding of metamodernism breaking out of colonial categories?
I guess we can aspire for that right now. Can't honestly say we are hitting the mark, but I guess that is sort of the goal. Because we're curious. I think that's also another key element to metamodernism. Your curiosity leads you down these paths of how to take it from a way of thinking to an embodiment. Like we didn't realize how much theopoetics was metamodern, and now it just makes sense. It came from curiosity. Curious, how does this work? Can it work? Can it, hold itself? But speaking with Dr. Butler opened my mind to this whole other digital realm that is very much a part of all of our lives. And so it really makes it even more complicated to say, can you break free for even a moment outside of the colonial sphere or matrix? Because that's what it has become. It's a matrix, a theopoetic, old smelly box. But what happens when you dip outside for somehow, some way you do, there's others, endless structures or matrices within matrices. We see that in quantum theory. Quantum theory kind of helps us imagine on a meta spiritual front, even in a meta modern framework, that these things are very complicated. It's not linear. It becomes circular, spherical, even more complicated than that. We understand space so much different. Metamodernism allows us to reinterpret everything. So that is, I think, our attempt to get us far away. Like we're trying to break the gravitational pull of colonialism as much as possible. But yes, you're right. It's a damn sun at this point, and we're orbiting around it. We're living off of it. We thrive off of it, and we have to acknowledge that. A lot of us are successful, are stable, are safe because of colonial thinking. It's just a reality, right? And a lot of us have ancestors that were in a position of slavery, but a lot of us today are profiting or are successful, are doing well for ourselves. Not all of us are, oppressed and in poverty and without. So it's very complicated. We can no longer look at it as this linear thing, point A and point B. It's like, I'm just trying to see how much further I can orbit, around this thing because I'm slowly trying to break free from this, perhaps orbital system to go to another. I cannot kid myself that I'm going to completely be free and I'm going to go through space and time and all by myself. Something else is going to pull you in, so what
Yeah.
do you think?
I think just to play on using the example of the Matrix, that they create this other world, this other space, but it's still a dichotomy of the world they used to exist in because they still have to create robot machines to protect themselves. They still create devices to poke into it and enter in to try to get more people out. And there are those in there that still believe that, you know what, that way of life was better. And then if you think about the last iteration of the Matrix films, there's a working of both ends, which is, I think, the aspiration of what metamodernism is trying to do and saying it's a both and, that we can find some beauty in that. And it's not perfect, but there's some wonderful things that can grow from it. And I think from that, I think it's right because there's a lot of wonderful aspects that grab from a process relational framework that I'm akin to and I enjoy and like. There's aspects of, like you mentioned, those theopoetics that come from out of paradox, out of ambiguity, that what emerges out of it is beauty, something novel and new, right? Which is, it's again for me process relational in that sense. And so yeah, there's just this beauty that comes from it. And maybe the idea is, yeah, in our critical engagement with it, we're going to find problems. And in our experiences and the traumas that come from it, we're going to find problems. We're going to lift it up. But if we're able to work with, to see it work together, what can come out of it could be beautiful. And something new emerges out of that as well. Sort of like a nobody wins or everybody wins.
Yeah, I like to think of it as make do with what you got. Yeah, yeah. Because if you just shift your perspective, you could make a whole lot out of nothing. Like we could perceive nothing. I'm not saying nothing exists. I'm just saying the perception of nothing. And we can turn that into an abundance of things, like just by shifting our perspectives and then our imaginations kicks in differently, So that's why I always think in a meta modern space, it's not about having everything. It's not about proving everything. It's not about knowing everything. It's just about, hey, I have what I have. I got to make the best of it. I'm enough. On a meta spiritual level, I'm enough. I may be broken or perceived to be broken, but I'm whole. I just have to change my perspective to see how I'm whole. And the process of healing trauma is changing that perspective, and it's hard.
I think also and you bring up a good point, and it's a question I'm left thinking is, all right, so we bring up modernity, categories out of modernity and what comes out of post-modernity. We'll bring up both the male and female or the masculine feminine characteristics. The question for me is what happens in, Whitehead says, what happens in the causal or in the efficient causation, right? Because for Whitehead in his Process and Reality, he breaks down there is a reason why we do things, or the reason why we think the way they do. He's using Aristotelian causation there. But when we get to the efficient causation, that's what counts, because we may have a reason why, but it's going to come out like this, because I'm also forced to make choices in the world or in the actual that realize this efficient causation, right? So we have to deal with that. Efficient could be pragmatic, so on and so forth. And I think maybe what Whitehead is trying also to say is that final causation is really trying to move efficient causation towards the final causation and make change using those Aristotelian. Is what meta-modernity trying to do? And here's my fear, or my concern is, does it allow to say, hey, we can talk about it, but in the pragmatic, I'm still going to choose hierarchy over dialogue and working together to do it. I'm going to choose the violence over discussion. That's my concern with meta-modernity, because it's not supposed to continue to do the same things over and over again, right? But it's supposed to affect us and move us more towards that final causation thing that Whitehead is talking. Was I clear on what I was thinking about? I don't know if. Just want to make sure that was an understanding that I was trying to make sense of. I think people can hide behind that, and that's concern. So I'm left to questions more than it.
Deep concern. Yes. And yes, you're spot on, because we hear you, and please correct us if we have misinterpreted, but we hear you saying, intentionality over the outcome. And like you're saying, people can hide behind that shit. I've seen that and experienced that firsthand, where you have manipulators and they will say, oh, my intention was to love you and support you. But then the outcome fell short of, no, that's not what you did. You just said you was going to do this. And so you're right. It comes down to, how do we break this cycle, and how do we hold people accountable? Right? Accountability. This is key. You step into a meta-modern space and you say openness. You say, I agree, everyone's valid. But then your outcome, or your fruit shows you're single-minded. You're about you. You're about your ideas and values, and you want to critique everyone else against yours. We have those, and theopoetically, you can call them like sharks swimming around, and again, they may say, oh, my intention here is to swim amongst the fish and be like you, but then the outcome is, why are you eating some of the fish? And then some of the fish, like ourselves, say, hey, there's a shark here. And they're eating some of the fish. And then some of the fish, they're just like, no, this is a process ocean. Like, everyone's welcome. Of course, everyone's welcome, but we need to set some damn boundaries. And then this is another complexity of metamodernism, creating those boundaries. And it's at those boundaries that we can have these dialogues. Because I'm not saying, like, you got to stay away from me forever, but you got to meet me at a certain point, and we got to talk about certain things. Because you eating up the fish, come on, I can't trust you. I can't let my guard down. I'm traumatized. Why am I here?
Yeah, I'm grateful for that analogy. I think that's why that, for me, an answer is a matrix. Is I'm forcing myself to say there can't be one. There just can't be one. And to see a matrix is to say my response has to answer to everything in that matrix. That's it. And my efficient causation has to move more towards my final causation, which is I answer to all that was within that matrix. My response has to be that. And that's not an easy answer. And I don't think that's an answer people want to hear. And that's not easy, but I think that's what we do. There's wisdom in moderation, there's wisdom in harmony that we see in maybe Buddhist thought, right? Zen Buddhism. Yeah. That's what I got.
I like using the movie The Matrix because it's interesting how the character Neo throughout the film is like, I'm not the one. And everyone's like trying to project onto him. You may be the one, the savior of us all. And it's like, that's heavy. That's a huge burden to carry, that I am the savior for all of the rest of humanity, free humanity, in the context of the movie. And it's just interesting to see the character development. I know that they weren't true to the original, how it was written, but just, following the character development and how in the Resurrection, the last film, you notice this intertwining or inclusion of the feminine. Some people said it was corny, but I just think on a symbolic front, it's deep, right? It goes to show you that Neo couldn't be as powerful without his other counterpart, and then together, nothing could stop them. I love that symbolism. It's like the yin and yang, the male, the masculine, feminine. Like we need both in order to fully come into the fold.
And when one thinks they're overpowering, and at most they've lost, they've been overpowered. That is the truth. That's a great way to think about this, how metamodernism is shaping our framework of thinking.
Definitely, definitely. Well, we've come to a close. It's time to step into the next process. Take some time to reflect further, write some more. Yes, exciting. But yeah, the book that we hope to put together in between season 1 and season 2, as we take our sabbatical, we are collaborating on a theopoetic book, talking about a lot of these issues that we were talking about throughout the last 13 episodes, and hopefully becoming a educational tool, a teaching tool to help people understand, this kind of train of thought and how we're piecing things together or learning things too that are changing our way of thinking. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement. I think, I think part of this podcast was to help us think about metamodernity over a period of time, metamodernism during a period of time, and now needing to put on paper, put on computer those thoughts in a more linear fashion. But I'm thankful you said theopoetic because it gives us room, breadth, and width to explore that in a different avenue and hopefully come out with some material that everyone can look at and read and reach out to every once in a while to help with their thinking on seeing the world as they're seeing it right now and what we're confronting with, and hopefully a way of thinking into the future that is more harmonious, that, I think the word harmonious is best. And then see how that shapes how we think about, the next season for our podcast.
Definitely. Definitely.
So I'll just say thank you, everybody, for listening to us, and please share
Yes.
podcasts and thoughts and ideas and ask questions. We enjoy dialogue. So if you can, share with us. But we want to thank you for walking along this journey of season 1.
Definitely. Definitely. Looking forward to season 2.
Yes. Well, Dr. Waldron, until next time.
Till next time, my friend.